It's been sitting for 3 years and you think it will start? The laugh that followed was sharp and dismissive, echoing off the corrugated steel walls of the maintenance hangar at Edwards Air Force Base in the heart of California's Mojave Desert. The speaker was Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man whose crisp flight suit and polished boots seemed immune to the dust and oppressive heat. At 52, he was the commander of the base's logistics wing, a man who believed in two things above all else: protocol and results. And the object of his scorn, a 1994 Ford F-350 pickup truck, represented a failure on both fronts. The truck sat in a forgotten corner of the hangar, a monument to bureaucratic neglect. Its once white paint was faded and peeling from years under the relentless desert sun. Its tires were cracked and flat, and a thick layer of dust covered it like a shroud. It had been relegated to the boneyard, the unofficial graveyard for vehicles deemed not worth the cost of repair, 3 years ago, after a team of military mechanics had failed to get it running and simply given up. But before we dig into the mechanical mystery that had been declared a lost cause, I want to ask, where in the world are you watching this story from? Are you in the United States, perhaps somewhere in Europe or another part of the globe? Drop a comment below and let us know. And tell me this, have you ever been completely underestimated because of your rank or position right before you accomplished? Something that left the doubters speechless. Let's build a community that loves to prove the experts wrong. The person on the receiving end of the colonel's derision was Sergeant Eva Rostova. At 29, she was a diesel mechanic in the base motor pool, and she did not fit the typical mold. She was quiet, methodical, and possessed a level of diagnostic skill that often made her superiors uncomfortable. She had respectfully requested permission to attempt to revive the old Ford truck. The base was facing a shortage of reliable utility vehicles, and Eva saw not a piece of junk, but a valuable asset being wasted. A truck with the legendary 7.3L Power-Stroke diesel engine, a pre-computerized workhorse known for its million-mile durability. Her request had been met with amusement by her direct superiors and had somehow reached the ears of Colonel Thorne himself, who had come down to the hangar personally to put an end to what he considered a waste of time and resources. "Sergeant," the colonel continued, his voice dripping with condescending patience, "let me be clear, that truck was condemned by a team of senior NCOs 3 years ago. They replaced the fuel pump, the injectors, the glow plug relay, everything the technical orders said to replace. It still wouldn't start. It is a lost cause. We are not in the business of sentimental science projects. We follow procedure. The procedure for this vehicle is to be stripped for parts and sold for scrap. Is that understood?" Eva stood at attention, her face impassive. "Sir, with all due respect, I've reviewed the maintenance logs. The team followed the TOs, but they never found the root cause. They just threw parts at the symptoms. I believe the problem is something simple, something they overlooked. I believe I can get it running." The colonel's laugh returned, this time shared by the 2 officers accompanying him. He saw this as a perfect, if frustrating, teaching moment about the chain of command. He decided to let her fail publicly. "Very well, Sergeant. You want to waste your time on that relic? Be my guest, but you will do it on your own time, after your regular duty hours. And I want a full report on my desk in 48 hours detailing your failure, so we can finally close the book on this truck and send it to the scrapyard where it belongs. Don't disappoint me." He turned and strode out of the hangar, leaving Eva with his parting shot hanging in the air. The message was clear. This was not an opportunity. It was a test designed for her to fail. Eva ignored the smirks from the other mechanics in the shop. She was used to being underestimated. Before enlisting, she had been one of the top diesel diagnosticians in the fiercely competitive world of professional truck pulling, where she became famous for her ability to solve complex engine problems under extreme pressure. She had joined the military for a sense of structure and purpose after her father, a retired Air Force Chief Master Sergeant, passed away. But she had quickly discovered that the military's rigid, by-the-book approach to maintenance often stifled the very kind of intuitive, out-of-the-box thinking that was her greatest strength. The mechanics were trained to follow the technical order, TU, a manual that told them exactly which parts to replace for a given fault code. They were not trained to be detectives. Eva was a detective. Her investigation began not with a wrench, but with the truck's dusty maintenance jacket. She spent 2 hours that evening poring over every service record, every handwritten note from the mechanics who had worked on it 3 years ago. The story it told was a familiar one. The truck had come in with a crank no start condition. Following the TO, the mechanics had first checked for fuel. They replaced the lift pump. Still no start. They replaced the entire set of 8 fuel injectors. Still no start. They replaced the expensive injection pressure regulator, IPR valve, and the injection control pressure, ICP sensor. Still no start. They moved on to the electrical side, replacing all 8 glow plugs and the glow plug relay. Still no start. Finally, after weeks of frustration and thousands of dollars in parts, they had declared the engine's main computer, the IDM injector driver module, to be faulty. But before a replacement could be ordered, a senior officer had deemed the truck economically unfeasible to repair, and it had been condemned to the boneyard. Eva saw their pattern. The mechanics had been chasing a ghost, and they had never once asked the most fundamental question: why were all these new parts not working? Her first physical inspection of the truck was forensic. She popped the hood, the hinges groaning in protest. The engine bay was surprisingly clean, protected from the worst of the desert dust. The new parts from 3 years ago still looked new. She began with the most basic of checks, the ones the previous team had likely skipped in their rush to follow the complex parts replacement flowcharts. She pulled the dipstick. The oil was old but full. She checked the air filter. It was clean. Then she turned her attention to the electrical system. The batteries were, of course, completely dead. She and a junior mechanic she had befriended, a young airman named Peterson, hauled 2 new heavy-duty batteries over and connected them. Eva climbed into the cab. The interior smelled of old vinyl and dust. She turned the key. The dashboard. Lights flickered on, a good sign. She turned the key to the start position. Nothing. Not even a click from the starter solenoid. "See? It's completely dead," Peterson said, already sounding defeated. "The starter's probably seized." Eva didn't answer. She knew a starter didn't just seize from sitting. She got out and consulted the wiring diagram she had printed out from a civilian Ford service manual, not the simplified military TO. She traced the starter circuit. The circuit was simple. Power. Went from the battery, through the ignition switch, through a starter relay, and finally to the starter solenoid. But there were 2 safety interlocks that could interrupt that signal. On an automatic transmission, it was the neutral safety switch. On a manual transmission like this one, it was the clutch safety switch, a small switch on the clutch pedal that prevents the engine from starting unless the clutch is fully depressed. She crawled under the dashboard with a flashlight. Just as she suspected, she found the clutch safety switch, and she found something else. The 2 wires leading to it had been cut and twisted together, completely bypassing the switch. This was a common field expedient fix that lazy mechanics often did when a switch failed. It was a clear violation of safety protocols, but it should have allowed the truck to start. So why wasn't it? "The starter relay isn't getting power," she murmured to herself, "but the clutch switch is bypassed. That doesn't make sense." This was the first real clue. The bypass should have completed the circuit, yet it hadn't. This meant the problem was somewhere else in the starting circuit. She spent the next hour meticulously tracing the wiring from the ignition switch to the starter relay. Everything looked fine. There were no breaks, no corrosion. It was a dead end. The puzzle was getting deeper. Frustrated, she sat in the driver's seat and stared at the dashboard, her mind replaying the sequence of events. Why? Would bypassing a safety switch not complete the circuit? It defied basic electrical theory. She looked down at the clutch pedal again. The bypassed switch was just hanging there by its wires, and then she saw it. Or rather, she saw what wasn't there. There was a second empty electrical connector dangling near the top of the clutch pedal assembly. The wiring diagram she had didn't show a second switch. What was it for? She knew that military technical orders were often oversimplified. They didn't always account for the small year-to-year changes that civilian manufacturers made. This was a loose thread, a detail that didn't fit. And Eva knew from experience that it's the details that don't fit that almost always hold the key. She had a new theory, a wild and counterintuitive idea, but to prove it she would need a part that hadn't been in the Air Force inventory for probably a decade. The discovery of the second, unconnected electrical connector near the clutch pedal was a turning point for Eva. It was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit any of the official schematics in the military's technical orders. While the other mechanics had ignored it as irrelevant, Eva saw it as the key. Her mind, accustomed to thinking in systems, began to form a hypothesis. What if the clutch pedal on this specific model year had two switches, a primary safety switch for the starter, which the previous mechanics had bypassed, and a secondary switch for something else? Something the TOs didn't mention. She spent the rest of the night digging through online forums and civilian mechanic databases on her personal laptop, cross-referencing part numbers and wiring diagrams for 1994 Ford F-350s with manual transmissions. And then, at 2 in the morning, she found it. A short, obscure post on a diesel enthusiast forum from 2008. The post described a rare, one-year-only design for the 7.3L Power Stroke. On this specific model, Ford had experimented with a secondary switch on the clutch pedal, a clutch cruise control cutout switch. Its primary job was to disengage the cruise control when the clutch was pressed, a standard feature. But, and this was the crucial detail, the Ford engineers had also given it a secondary, undocumented function. It sent a signal to the injector driver module, IDM, when the clutch was depressed, telling the computer that the driver was about to start the engine. In response, the IDM would initiate a special pre-prime sequence, firing the injectors for a fraction of a second before the engine even started to crank. This pre-prime shot of fuel was designed to make cold starts easier on manual transmission vehicles. Eva's heart began to race. It all made sense. The truck had been sitting for 3 years. The fuel in the lines had likely drained back to the tank. The high-pressure oil system that powered the injectors was dry. When the previous mechanics cranked the engine, the IDM was trying to fire the injectors, but it took a long time to build up enough fuel and oil pressure to actually make them work. Without that initial pre-prime shot of fuel, the engine would never catch. It would just crank and crank, a crank-no-start condition. And the reason the pre-prime sequence wasn't happening? Because the second switch was missing. The previous team had probably broken it or lost it when they were working on the primary clutch switch, dismissed it as unimportant because it wasn't in their manual, and never replaced it. They had been chasing a fuel problem, replacing thousands of dollars in parts, when the root cause was a missing $10 switch that was preventing the fuel from being delivered at the most critical moment. The problem now was finding the part. The switch, a one-year-only part for a 30-year-old truck, was long obsolete from Ford and certainly not in the Air Force's massive but rigid inventory system. Her request for the part was met with a bureaucratic brick wall. The GAO supply sergeant looked up the part number she provided, saw that it didn't exist in the system for this vehicle model, and denied the request. "Sergeant, the system says this truck doesn't have that switch. Therefore, you don't need it. I can't order a part that doesn't exist," he had said with infuriating circular logic. Eva was on her own. She spent her lunch break making calls. She called every auto parts store in a 50-mile radius. Nothing. She called junkyards. Nothing. Finally, she found a small family-owned Ford specialist scrapyard in Bakersfield, 3 hours away. The old man who answered the phone knew the part immediately. "Oh yeah, the cruise clutch switch for the 94 Power Stroke. Weird one-year part. Haven't seen one of those in ages. I think I might have one in an old coffee can full of switches. Let me look." An hour later he called back. He had found it. It was used, it was dirty, but it was the right part. The price? $10. Eva drove the 3 hours to Bakersfield after her shift, a 6-hour round trip on her own time, and bought the $10 switch. She returned to the base late that night, holding the small, insignificant-looking plastic part in her hand like a precious jewel. The next day was the deadline Colonel Thorne had given her. The 48 hours were almost up. As she walked into the hangar in the morning, the atmosphere was tense. The colonel was already there, along with his entourage and a crew from the base's scrap metal disposal unit, who were standing by with a flatbed truck, ready to haul the Ford away. The message was clear. This was the final act. "Sergeant Rostova," the colonel said, his voice cold and formal. "Your time is up. Have you completed your science project so that my men can get on with their work?" Eva didn't salute. She simply held up the small plastic switch. "Just about, sir. I just need to install this one last part." The colonel looked at the tiny switch, then at the massive truck, and let out a short, sharp laugh. You're telling me that a $10 piece of plastic is going to fix a problem that a team of my best men and $20,000 in parts couldn't? Sergeant, this is becoming pathetic. Install your little trinket. Let's get this farce over with. Eva ignored the condescending tone and the snickers from the other mechanics. She calmly crawled under the dashboard of the F-350. First, she removed the crude bypass the previous mechanics had installed on the main clutch. Safety switch, and carefully reconnected the wires to a new primary switch she had requisitioned. Then she turned to the empty connector. The $10 switch from the junkyard clicked perfectly into place. The entire installation took her less than 4 minutes. She slid out from under the dash, her hands covered in dust but her expression calm. The hangar was silent. Everyone was watching. This was the moment of truth. She had not replaced a single expensive part. She had not plugged in a single computer. Her entire fix consisted of removing a bypass and installing a tiny, obsolete switch. From a purely logical, by-the-book perspective, she had done nothing of significance. She walked to the driver's side door. "Airman Peterson," she called out. "Would you stand by with a fire extinguisher, please? Standard procedure." The young airman, who had been watching her with a mixture of hope and fear, scrambled to grab an extinguisher. The colonel rolled his eyes at the theatricality of, "Oh, it all." Eva climbed into the cab. She put the key in the ignition. She looked out at the sea of skeptical faces. Then her eyes met the colonel's. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she pushed the clutch pedal all the way to the floor, engaging both the primary and the secondary switches for the first time in over 3 years. She turned the key. There was a click as the glow plug relay engaged. A wait-to-start light on the dash illuminated, then went out. She turned the key the rest of the way. The starter engaged, and the 7.3L Power Stroke engine began to crank. It turned over once, twice, and then, with a thunderous roar that shook the entire hangar and sent a cloud of black diesel smoke billowing into the rafters, the engine exploded to life. It didn't just start, it erupted. It ran with a smooth, powerful, deafening rumble, a sound of pure, untamed mechanical power that had been silent for 3 long years. The sound of the F-350's engine was a physical shockwave in the cavernous hangar. The team from the scrap disposal unit, who had been joking and leaning against their flatbed, all jumped. The mechanics who had been snickering fell silent, their mouths agape. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood frozen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He was staring at the impossible. The truck he had personally condemned, the lost cause that had defeated his best and brightest, was running. And it wasn't just running. It sounded healthy, powerful, and angry, as if furious at having been left for dead for so long. Eva let the engine run for a full minute, a triumphant, rumbling symphony that drowned out all doubt. Then, with a turn of the key, she shut it off, and the sudden silence was even more profound than the noise had been. She climbed down from the cab, wiping her hands on a rag, and walked calmly towards the stunned colonel. The entire hangar was looking at her, no longer with derision, but with a kind of fearful respect. She had done magic. She had performed a miracle. The colonel finally found his voice, but his usual tone of command was gone, replaced by a quiet, baffled whisper. "How?" It was the only word he could manage. "What did you do?" "We replaced everything. The entire fuel system." "You did, sir," Eva interrupted, her voice respectful but firm. "You replaced every part that could fail. But you never stopped to ask if the parts were getting the right instructions. You were all trying to fix a hardware problem. But the EE problem was never the hardware. It was a single line of missing code." She pulled the old broken clutch switch from her pocket. "This switch has 2 functions on this specific model year, a detail that's not in the standard military TO. Its first job is to let you start the engine, which your men bypassed. But its second job is to send a signal to the injector driver module to initiate a fuel pre-prime sequence before the engine cranks. Without that pre-prime shot, a cold engine with dry fuel, lines will never start. Your men, in bypassing the broken switch, accidentally disabled the one command the engine needed to hear. You spent $20,000 trying to solve a fuel problem when the real problem was that you were telling the fuel to arrive a second too late." She then held up the $10 switch she had pulled from a coffee can in a Bakersfield junkyard. This was the solution. Not a new fuel pump, not new injectors. A $10 switch that delivers the right command at the right time. The simplicity of it was brutal. The entire expensive month-long failure had been caused by a complete misunderstanding of the system's logic, a failure to appreciate a single, undocumented detail. Colonel Thorne looked from the switch in her hand to the faces of his senior mechanics, who were now staring at the ground in shame. He had berated them, threatened them, and ultimately given up on them, but they had just been following the procedures he had drilled into them, their entire careers. The failure was not theirs. It was his. His rigid by-the-book system had failed. In that moment, Colonel Thorne made a decision that would change the course of his career and the culture of his command. He turned to face the entire assembly of mechanics and officers. "Sergeant Rostova is correct," he announced, his voice booming with its old authority, but now tinged with a new humility. This was not a failure of maintenance. This was a failure of leadership. My leadership. I fostered a culture that values following orders over thinking critically. I allowed our reliance on procedure to replace our reliance on expertise. Sergeant Rostova did not just fix a truck today. She has exposed a fundamental flaw in how we operate, and for that she has my deepest respect and a formal commendation. He then turned to Eva. "Sergeant, as of this moment you are being reassigned. I am creating a new unit, the Complex Diagnostics and Systems Integration Unit. It will have its own budget, its own workshop, and its own mandate. Your job will be to solve the unsolvable problems, to train our technicians to think like engineers, and to rewrite our diagnostic procedures to be smarter, not just more rigid. You will report directly to me. You will build your own team. You will have whatever you need." The promotion was unprecedented. A sergeant being given command of a special unit, reporting directly to a full colonel, was unheard of, but the demonstration of her skill had been so total, so undeniable, that no one dared question it. The story of Sergeant Rostova and the ghost of the boneyard became an instant legend at Edwards Air Force Base. The F-350, after a new set of tires and a good cleaning, was put back into service. It was nicknamed the $10 Miracle and became the official vehicle of Eva's new unit. It was a constant driving reminder that the most complex problems can have the simplest solutions, and that true expertise often lies hidden where you least expect it. Eva's new unit revolutionized maintenance not just at Edwards, but across the Air Force. She and her hand-picked team of misfit mechanics, the ones who, like her, always asked why, developed new diagnostic techniques that blended old-school mechanical knowledge with advanced systems analysis. They saved the Air Force millions of dollars in unnecessary parts and repairs and dramatically increased vehicle readiness rates. Eva wrote new technical orders, ones that were living documents, filled with the kind of real-world details and diagnostic strategies that had been missing before. She started a Detail of the Week briefing, where she would highlight a small, overlooked mechanical or electrical quirk, like the dual-function clutch switch, teaching hundreds of mechanics to look deeper and think more critically. Colonel Thorne became her biggest champion. He had learned a profound lesson in humility that day in the hangar. He realized that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about creating an environment where people with the answers felt empowered to speak up, regardless of their rank. He became a more effective, more respected commander. He and Eva, the unlikely duo of the by-the-book colonel and the out-of-the-box sergeant, formed a powerful professional bond built on mutual respect. The failure of the F-350 had ultimately led to the greatest success of his command. The story serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the obstacle is not the problem itself, but the way we have been trained to look at it. The 30 mechanics weren't incompetent. They were trapped inside a system that discouraged the very kind of thinking needed to solve the problem. Eva succeeded because she was willing to step outside that system, to trust her intuition, and to dig for the one small, crucial detail that everyone else had dismissed as unimportant. It's a lesson in the power of a different perspective and the quiet genius of seeing the puzzle that lies hidden beneath the procedure. So, as we finish this story, I ask you one final time, where are you watching from? What is the obvious bypass or shortcut in your life that might actually be the source of a deeper problem? What is the small overlooked detail that could change everything? Let me know in the comments below, because Eva Rostova proved that sometimes the most powerful tool is not a wrench or a new part, but the courage to question the manual. Let's build a community that celebrates finding that one game-changing detail, together.